and thank you for joining us again. Welcome back to those of you who've been part of Impact 2020 before, and welcome to any newbies who might be joining for our governance session today on lifting our gaze for social impact. Before I kick off, let me also on this National Reconciliation Week acknowledge the Indigenous people and pay my respects and appreciation for the incredible leadership that we see across our Indigenous community, their amazing culture, language, dreamings, art. They make such an incredible contribution to the society that we live in. Let me also acknowledge that I'm sitting in Gadigal country. It is and always was been Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And let me pay my respects to any Indigenous people who might be with us today, and of course our elders, any Indigenous leaders in the present and also emerging. So we are here for a webinar on governance or leadership that's all about the social impact. For those of you who might be new to CSI, and I'm just trying to get my slide pack to share. It's not turning to the next. I've just got to try and work out why my computer's not going to the next slide. But as I go on, let me just tell you about the Centre for Social Impact. You would know that we are, there we go. For many of you, you know, we sit across 3 universities. We are a national education and research centre. Our goals are really about catalysing positive social change. The presentation that Shamal and I are giving today is all around our Governance for Social Impact course. And you can see the little digital badging on your screen. This is an intensive 2-day course that we run for non-executive directors and C-suites. We have had so far over 170 leaders take part in our course. And we can say it's great, but actually they also tell us through our NPS that they like this course. And I guess, you know, just to frame things up, let me first introduce Shamal Das, and then I'm going to throw a question to him and we'll go into the presentation and make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So Shamal is the head of philanthropic services at Care. Some of you may know him in that regard. He also is an adjunct associate professor with the University of New South Wales. He co-designed and co-delivers the Governance for Social Impact Executive Education course with me. He's an economist, don't hold that against him. He has got a history of working with the financial services sector and advising high net worth individuals on their philanthropic giving and around trust and a whole bunch of other things. Importantly for this particular context, he serves on a number of boards and advisory councils, including as a non-exec director of Earthwatch and also the Too Good Foundation. He chairs the Constellation Project and sits on a number of advisory roles. Welcome, Shamal, and thank you for presenting with me. So just to kind of set the scene for this, tell us, why does lifting your gaze for social impact matter from a governance perspective? Isn't fiduciary responsibility enough?
If only it was. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I'm in my office today so we can get some quiet from my 8-year-old and looking at this beautiful country as you join in. And thank you for the 110 participants who decided that governance was a wonderful thing to learn about on a Thursday morning. And thank you for having me on. So I guess the proof is in the pudding. So if we look out around us, if fiduciary style governance was enough, we would have made a lot of headway in the problems we seek to solve. And we haven't. And this is my, I guess, as a frustrated optimist, the reason this course came about was from an early conversation we had, well, is traditional governance delivering the outcomes? And it clearly wasn't. And this is the work we do with our clients. So traditional governance is about duty. It's about duty of loyalty to your organization. It's about duty of obedience around laws and regulation. It's about duty of care to the public and the beneficiaries. And it's really that last one. So when we talk about lifting our gaze, it's really about saying, well, governance, the duties are important, and there are a lot of courses that will teach you your duties, but it's actually about leadership. In our sector, a mission-based sector, one that revolves around beneficiaries and outcomes, it's actually the role of the board. And this is the most important, I guess this is the genesis of the whole course as well. The role of the board is to hold the organisation to account to the beneficiary. There is no market mechanism. There is often no buying consumer that holds the organisation to account. So that is held by the board. And so in that frame, for me, governance becomes more about leadership. It is about oversight of mission development, mission review, and mission fidelity. It is about accountability, not around just finance and risk, but performance against mission. That is the key. It's mission performance that matters most, not P&L growth, not balance sheets. And it is about the evaluation of both the executive and the board performance in delivering against strategy and mission. And that's really where it all comes from.
So I guess on that note, thinking about this course, because it's 2 days, it's intensive, we want to make sure that we can capture this in almost one key question. And the question that we ask our non-exec directors and our C-suite leaders or aspiring leaders is, what might happen or what might we achieve if we lift our gaze and lead not just for our organisations, but for the social impact for which we exist? And I think if nothing else, take that question away and have a think about it in regard to the roles that you might play. The course is underpinned by what looks like a fairly complicated conceptual framework. Let me just step you through this in a nutshell. So we basically step through this concept where we want people to start in this space around having absolute clarity of purpose. And what we want people to do is, of course, people understand purpose and vision and mission and strategy, but we're slightly tweaking it. So at each of these stages, we're asking people to lift their gaze to the next step. So in starting with this clarity of purpose, we want people to think about the reason for which they exist. We move around to having clarity around the problem or progress that you want to make or problem you're solving for within the context of a beneficiary. And Shamal and I will step through at speed some of these stages. We then move across to the clarity of the problem, the progress we want to make. And it's only after that do we then move to mission. And the key thing around thinking about the impact we want to have as opposed to our organisation is often we start with this notion of mission as opposed to the purpose or the problem. Then we move to strategy, and then finally around to clarity of impact and mission performance. So we're just going to quickly step through each of these just to give you a little taster of this 2-day very intense course. It has readings and a whole lot of application of tools around it. One of the key pieces to this puzzle in Rethinking Vision is to have absolute clarity of purpose. Organisations and non-exec directors and leaders are often really great at being able to articulate the purpose of the organisation, and you see it written very articulately on websites and on collateral of various organisations. The bit that we really want to drill into, though, is, do you have clarity of the problem you are solving for? And what change you and your organisation then seek to contribute to. In terms of that, you need to delve into the context and have an absolutely deep and sound understanding of the issue in the broader context of the system. Now, we don't have time to do a whole lesson on systems thinking, but let me give you a cartoon that just gives you a taste of why systems thinking actually matters. I do really like this cartoon, as horrifying as it is. And I think what it shows is that sometimes if we don't think in that systems thinking way, it's very easy to misinterpret what the problem might be and what might need to be fixed. And I think we've all seen examples where that might occur. So one of the things we do is position this system into an ecosystem that people actually live in. So if you take this as without me going into the details of systems thinking, and you think about the systems that people live in and your beneficiaries are in, we can start at this orange layer around individuals and their particular characteristics. We move up, they sit within a family context, a particular community infrastructure. There are particular opportunities available to them, et cetera, et cetera. I think the key thing is what's interesting from a board and a purpose and clarity of understanding the problem perspective is often people start with the organisation. What we want to flip is getting people to start with the beneficiary, and it's starting at this: who are we actually trying to serve, and what problems do we seek to solve? And only then do you add the star of where your organisation might be sitting. Because we know within systems that systems have a whole lot of agents, organisations or individuals that can do certain things. They pull certain levers that create certain changes. We also then can start to say, well, given this system, where does my organisation actually sit? And the key thing there is thinking about what influence you might have within this ecosystem, who the other agents are that might be playing around the ecosystem, where there are barriers and opportunities. And importantly, to systems thinking, there are often feedback loops that we really need to understand. So if you've got a particular goal for beneficiaries your organisation seeks to serve, and you can work out where you sit in the ecosystem, you can start to think about what role you might play. Before we get on to mission, though, and the role of organisations, one other key thing that we spend quite a bit of time on in the course is around the problems that people want to solve for. And I think that it's probably collectively known that a problem in the system is everybody's problem, and how easily things might otherwise go wrong. But part of the key thing around this is understanding the problem you're solving for, and that there are different types of problems, and different types of problems require different kinds of solutions. And we spend quite a bit of time thinking about simple problems, complicated problems, complex problems, and how you actually address those things as individual problems, but also collectively. So having clarity on the type of problem you're solving for, not just what that problem is really important. So that then moves us in our ecosystem map around to mission. And once you've spent time on clarity of that purpose, the problem you're solving for, understanding that problem within the ecosystem, then the question is, well, where does my organisation sit? And as a board director, then, what is the purpose for which I exist? Under the Charities Act, we are all not-for-profits because we serve a public good. And the question is, to meet that public good, what role will my organisation play? And that's where mission clarity comes in. One of the toolkits that we use that helps boards put boundaries around what the work is that gets done is a theory of change blueprint. This is at an organisational level. Some of you will be well familiar with theories of change at a programmatic level. What we ask board directors and C-suites to do is to lift their gaze and think about, well, what does this look like at the organisation level? And what this can help to do is set boundaries around the types of activities that get done. One of the traps that we sometimes see is organisations tend to do particular activities, and they put the activities within some kind of logic frame, as opposed to the other way round of saying, well, actually, what impact do we want to have? What outcomes are we going to achieve? And then what work do we do? And what are the assumptions that we would do that work within? We go into a whole lot more detail around this in the course, but giving you the expedited version, I'm going to move along. So it's really after having clarity of that purpose, clarity of the problem and the context and the role you're going to play, that you then can only move on to strategy and clarity of the how. So I'm going to pass on to Shamal, who's going to take us through the next couple of steps.
Thank you, Kristy. As you can tell, we have to deliver a 3-day course in 2 days, which we're giving to you in about 30 minutes. So, you know, it's hard for me to follow. So I hope you're doing well. Look, and this is important. An important element here is strategy appears somewhere at the start of day 2. And it's really amazing because most of the conversations that boards want to have with me as their strategic advisor and governance advisor is they want to talk about scale a lot. They want to talk about strategy all the time. And the reason we take them all the way back to vision and the mission and the beneficiary is because all those bits have to be in place in some way before you can develop a strategy that is coherent in any sense. And for a non-profit, it's really about the end game. And the end game is about the beneficiary. And again, it's the outcome. Outcomes belong to the beneficiary. They do not belong to the organization. And this is the important part. So what is it that you seek to achieve is the important starting point. And, you know, so these contextualizations of the why, the what, and the how is what we go through, because the important part of a non-profit strategy is there are two significant parts. There's a funding model and there's an impact model, and they have to fit together coherently. Then you have a functioning, sustainable organization. Often we're finding there's a lot of discussion around the funding model, and the impact model is kind of assumed or tacked on. It is as critical. It's actually more important that you have your impact model in place and the funding model that actually supports it and makes sense together. Because sometimes it's a government-led funding model, sometimes it's philanthropic, sometimes it might be a social enterprise and fee generating, but you must know that as a board. You must ask the questions that reveal that. So really the important thing here is when we talk about scaling a strategy, scaling is a discussion about impact, not about your organization. You leave with one thing here: if your board, if your executive are asking you to scale, your question is about, are we scaling impact or are we just scaling our organization? It is the critical question, because you can scale an organization and actually reduce impact. You can triple your size and actually do worse if you do not understand your impact model and what it is you're trying to achieve. So we go through this bit in some detail. We do some leadership challenges around it. And then we get to the how, because the how is really going to be determined by what you're scaling. Understanding your true IP and how you generate impact means you may be able to scale without scaling your organization at all. You may be scaling because of your partnerships with other organizations. You may be scaling because you are delivering services now through others. The current crisis is going to be asking us a lot of questions about our strategy, how we actually scale impact. And second of all, it actually asks the fundamental question about what were all these assumptions we made in our theory of change that we were relying on to operate. Because if we operate in A and the current crisis has actually changed the environment completely, what exactly are we scaling? If there is no funding model now, what are we scaling? If the way we delivered impact has changed completely because telehealth is all of a sudden, you know, a 10-year dream has become a reality in about 3 months, what does that mean for us? So really going back to those fundamental questions is really important in this crisis moment. And it's something we're thinking about and writing at the moment. So in the next slide, I think we cover the two important elements of scale. We spend all our time in that, I guess, in that right-hand box, which is the strategic management elements of scale, the time, talent, treasure, you know, how are we organizationally? That's important, we get that. That's the analysis we do. The part, as I was sort of alluding to in the last slide, that's missing is the strategic thinking. The board's part is to make sure that the questions are answered on the left-hand box before you scale, because that is fundamental fuel for scaling, because you can scale your organization in the other box without scaling impact unless you have a coherent model, you understand your mission entirely. There is a scale and scope bound on your mission. You know, for whom do you serve, in which area do you serve? Because scale means you're going to move one of those. And are you in fact evaluating both the work you're doing, but also how you're delivering the work? Because often we'll find strategically scaling will fail not in the idea, but in the execution. So measurement is critical. Asking the questions about what you're going to measure in the scaling as a board to know when to stop, when to say no, when to give up, or when to bring someone else in. You know, this is the role of the board in our view. And I guess the last element that we cover in the scale discussion is actually around business models, which is in the next slide. And the business model part is actually about not just understanding where you are as simply as an organization, because we all, I sit on the boards, we all get our consolidated P&L, you know, are we solvent is the first question. You know, is anyone going to jail? It's a good place to start. But beyond that, it's about saying, well, okay, so we have this much money in the bank. This is our P&L for the year. This is our balance sheet. a strong P&L and a strong balance sheet can actually hide a multitude of sins unless you pick at, understanding where you are as an organization in all those little dots. And I think those little dots come up at some point here. But the critical thing is to understand what each part of your organization is doing. So, if I was thinking about, NAB as a business or JB Were, retail banking has a different margin to JB Were. They're different operational models. They have different margins. They have different business models. Understand where each one of those stars is in your organization, because there should be stars all over the place. And if you're a bigger organization, you have to understand that, yes, we run this government contract runs at a loss, but it is highly impactful, and that's the main funding for it. So we have to complement that by through philanthropy or through one of our other business models that generates income and cross-subsidizes. But what can happen, and what has happened in some of the case examples we use during the courses, we have CEOs come in and talk about for-profit or really fat contracts that actually allow the organization to run really inefficiently in the other parts just because they can. And it's not holding the discipline and the margin to each part of the business, and also asking questions about, is that program, should that really be there? Is that the right number for that program? And God forbid, do we have anything in the bottom left quadrant? Do we have something that creates very little impact, actually may harm communities and runs at a loss? Are we, this is where that mission creep question comes in. Are we just doing it because some really wealthy philanthropist asked us to do it? And it's not really a great idea, but great. Hey, look at that. We got the $1 million in the P&L. These are the questions for the board. This is what we need the management to keep coming back to us with and saying, where are we? Where should it be? And that we know how that big number that comes in the final P&L that we all get through in all our meetings, where did that come from? And this is what we really try to break down through the examples. And then I guess only when we get through all that, and I'll throw back to Kristy here because performance measurement is her lifeblood, and something she spent many years doing all the way through randomized controlled trials and such. But as you can imagine, this only when you know the other bits of that puzzle do you actually understand what you're trying to measure for success, what actually matters. So over to you, Kristy.
Thanks, Shamal. I think maybe I'm just going to add one thing before we move on to measuring impact, and I won't spend too long on this because I really want to make sure I've got time for questions. But just adding to Shamal's piece around strategy, and he mentioned mission creep. And I think that's a really interesting conversation, and maybe we can chat about it more in the Q&A section. But I think understanding mission creep, mission drift, and mission stretch, and the difference between those three is almost, it's always important, but now given COVID and given, and one of the things I didn't say is I also sit on a bunch of not-for-profit boards, pro bono. So, we are all looking at these things at the moment to say, well, what should our theory of change be now? What's changing the ecosystem? How do we think differently about the work we do? What needs to change? What doesn't? And are we still mission aligned, or do we need to stretch given a shift in circumstances, or is that just a mission creep problem? Or are we drifting away from the purpose for which we exist, or has even the needs of our beneficiary changed? So I think that conversation around mission creep, mission stretch, mission drift is actually really important.
And it's important because the work we do at Harvard tells us that mission, some of those are problems, but some of those are actually good for an organization, because sometimes you can get very lazy in a certain spot and the world's moved. And one of the alumni from the course actually called it beneficiary drift. The organization ends up doing something that no longer serves the beneficiary, but they're hugely successful because they've actually scaled their operational model.
And I guess actually, if you remember the slide a couple of pieces ago, where Shamal had these boxes, one of the ones he didn't pick up was courage. And I think on the point that he just landed on, the courage piece is really important, because if all of a sudden you're doing something, and he gave the example where the rich philanthropist comes across and says, do you want the $1 million? And you think, well, we could really do with the money, but actually it's not our work. Do you have the courage to say no? Do you have the courage to say no to a government contract that undercuts? Do you have the courage to say in your kind of theory of change and activities that actually this isn't our work, or the beneficiaries don't need this anymore? Sometimes you'll be making strategic decisions, absolutely, where you have to do things that may not be perfectly aligned, and you will make a conscious decision to do that. And I think that's a different ball game. But I think that piece around courage is actually really important. So I guess the wrap up then, and again, this is, you know, the expedited 30-minute version, so we have time for Q&A, of a very detailed, intensive 2-day course. We do lots of application of this work and lots of workshopping. It's very experiential. The final piece of the puzzle is clarity of impact. And there are a host of questions and things that boards should be considering around clarity of impact. If I have to summarize that, the one thing that you should be asking is, are you making a difference for the people who matter most? So who are your primary beneficiaries, and are you making a difference for the people who matter most? And back to where we started around this purpose piece and clarity of the purpose, it's never about the organisation. Even though as directors, we know that we have responsibilities as directors, legal responsibilities, to meet the needs of our organisations, and we get taught with things like AICD, which is a great course for roles and responsibilities, that we have to meet those responsibilities of our organisation. But as public good organisations, are we making a difference for the people who matter most? And there's a whole host of other questions that board directors can start thinking about in terms of measuring impact. You don't need to be an impact measurement specialist as an exec director, you just have to have the right questions to ask. So on that kind of note, I think the other piece to this puzzle that you'll notice in this slide at the bottom is effective leadership. And throughout the very intensive 2 days, we weave leadership and leadership skill sets and leadership archetypes and all sorts of things to do with leadership through the course, because it's really critical. We have amazing leaders in our sector that we're very lucky to have. But as you know, and particularly given the times we're in, things are really volatile, they're ambiguous, they're uncertain. And interestingly enough, Berger and Johnson wrote this back in 2015, that, you know, given this sort of VUCA environment, that volatile, uncertain, et cetera, climate, we need leadership that brings us new habits. And those habits of mind that will make our leadership effective in these uncertain times, they summarise into 3 pieces. One is the ability to ask different questions. 2, seek different perspectives. So seek them and see them. And finally, see systems. And I think if, you know, we talk through lots of leadership literature and themes and types, but actually those are 3 that are really useful, as well as thinking about leadership traps that will serve you well in a governance sense.
And I'll just add, because a lot of people do find this interesting, is it's in that frame, and it's a frame of as we cover in the course around, it's diversity for us in boards is more about how people think than about how they look. As I say in the course, 10 investment bankers, no matter how diverse they look, are investment bankers. They only have the one single thought amongst them. And I'm one of them, so I'm going to go myself. But the important thing there is it's the diversity of experience and the diversity of, you know, having an engineer ask certain questions in a social enterprise board is amazing, because they just see the world differently. They're wired differently. And having that in the boardroom, you know, having a smooth sailing boardroom is actually a huge concern. For me, if people aren't asking different questions, you're in trouble probably. So since I've taken over, I'll just do the key insights. So we've taught over 120 odd people now, 170 odd people over 3 years now. And there's a couple of things we want to leave you with is to grab Kristy's point there. What we found is there is no lack of talent and passion in the sector, and the diversity is immense. It's you know, you could nearly take some of our classrooms out of central casting. It's an amazing group. But what we're trying to do is say, well, there's no lack of intellect and passion. What seems to be lacking are the tools, and very clear, pragmatic tools that can be applied every day. And that's what board directors really need. And they also need the network of other passionate people to actually rebound off outside their boards, you know, the network to help you and support you. But these are a few observations that we've grabbed, that comes up in every course we run, is beneficiaries are often forgotten as an agent in their own system. The outcome belongs to them. They have a role to play in achieving that outcome. The patronizing old colonial approach to doing it to them or at them or for them doesn't work. And to understand, we explore ideas of power and imbalance and those things as well, because it's really important. Another thing that's critical that the commercial sector often is a benefit to them is directors lack the executive experience. There are very few board directors who haven't been very high-level executives in the corporate sector before they've gotten to board roles. Whereas in the non-profit sector, most board directors, a huge majority, have never been a CEO or an executive in the non-profit sector. So understanding organizational BAU challenges are usually missing. Directors are smart and love making decisions, but this is a double-edged sword because an action bias is a dangerous thing. If you gain nothing from today, governance is about asking questions, not having answers. It's a victory about asking insightful questions. And the important thing is, for us, is this can be daunting stuff. And from traditional systems thinking, you're always looking from systems from the top, the health system, the education system. And when you flip it to the beneficiary, it's actually systems simplify in a sense, because you have to actually sit with them as an organization and see, well, what is it that they need in their system to get an outcome? And so we must at least all be systems thinkers to understand our organization's role in change. We don't have to sit there in a Machiavellian sense and manipulate the system from the top. There are very few organizations with the scales and the capability to do that, and they should do that, but most of us aren't. And the last thing is, I guess, in the current moment we're in, and some of these are captured in a paper that actually should be on our website today, the JB Weir website, and I'm sure we'll link it when we do the end of this, is a reflections piece that I've written through the board roles, and Kristy and I have been having discussions, is, what have we observed? And this is a time for reflection, because what we think is the pivot from crisis to recovery, if it happens too quickly, you've actually missed a moment to re-engineer and reimagine your organization. And what we think about now is, what have we learned? We have learned that all organizations, non-profits as well as corporates, are much more agile than any of us had imagined. Apparently we can all work from home. Apparently we all have technology capabilities. I would say not everyone.
Not a whole lot of small not-for-profits have no money.
And a lot of disadvantaged communities now, right? So we're finding out where those assumptions.
2.5 mil.
Yeah, I know.
Anyway, go on.
Our executives manage well in crisis, but the important thing for a board is, are you making tactical moves that actually limit your own strategy? Are you making decisions today? Are you cutting off your nose to spite your face? Just for survival? That is an important, courageous question, as they said. A lot of boards have leaned in, but not all. So we're trying to explore why some boards have stayed a bit aloof there. And really big concerns about the crisis, the impact of the crisis on the people, especially the management, because if they're the same ones who have to do the re-managing and the pivot into the new future, how do you manage people? How do you manage burnout? How do you set a vision and keep hope? And so this reflections paper, as I said, is really about saying, well, what are we learning? And also understanding the race you're in. As the analogy I use in it is, crisis management is about sprinting. Most of our work is about marathons, and sprinters, as we know, do not win marathons. So being great at crisis management may not be the best long-term thing for your organization. So it's the board's role to hold that. And we'll stop there, I think.
Yeah, so we'll go to, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go to Q&A. We haven't, as Rhonda said, been looking at the Q&A, but she's been collecting them for us. I'm sure there's some cool things. Otherwise, Shamal and I are quite good at bantering if we can't take up the next 20 minutes with your questions.
Just ruminate.
Hi, everyone. The reflections piece that you were just talking about, I've been trying to find it on the website. Are you able to share that in the link, Shamal?
I will in due course. Once we stop going through the questions, I'll get it in there. 1 second.
We've got lots of questions, which is really great. I'll start with the first one. Simple one from both Bridget and Selena. They just want to know where the course will be held in the future. Will it be online? Will you be coming back to Perth? Where will it be?
Are we allowed
Well, once the states open their borders, we will be there and accessible. We took the course to Perth for the first time last year. Yes, last year. We have done Perth, Melbourne, Perth, Melbourne, Sydney so far. We are interested in taking it to other states and territories. We have had some fabulous directors who've flown into other states. We are offering it this year. We had to move our March cohort, so we're about to offer it again in August in Sydney, September in Melbourne, but we will share up the link with the actual relevant dates. And then we had been partnering with JB Ware, so we've been running this in collaboration with the AGSM, so it is micro-credentialed. You can get points that go towards other types of professional development. And so we were planning on getting back to Perth before COVID hit. So it is our intent to go back to WA. In terms of running it online, one of the things that we do quite a lot of is a lot of experiential work. So it's a pretty intensive executive education program where board directors work together, and often we do a whole lot of things where we set up mock boards. We do leadership challenges, we do mock boards around the experiential work we do and the toolkits that we have. And the goal of that is to make sure that people can then go back to their own boards and organisations and say, well, then how do I use this? So it doesn't become this kind of interesting intellectual exercise where you're challenged and you think differently, but we really want this to have some kind of applied impact. So we haven't flipped the course yet to online. If for any reason we cannot go ahead with our face-to-face teaching this year, we Shamal and I have endeavoured to promise with the AGSM that we will put it online.
Yeah, and it's a challenge because, as I said, there's a lot of experiential elements there that we want to hold. And a big part of it is, I have posted the link to the paper there on the site there. I think it's for everyone. Importantly, we try to keep, when you spend 2 days with the group under Chatham House rules, the relationships established are really deep and long term, and the trust in the room is critical to the success. And we endeavour to keep those alumni together as well. And if you see in that reflections paper, I know that is based on discussions we had with those cohorts coming back together and discussing their own challenges. And it always surprises us, I think, how open they are about the challenges of some of the largest organisations in this country around delivering on mission.
And I think that's one of the other pieces around like the trust you can build when you're face to face with others. And, you know, anyone on this call that's in currently or been in a leadership role, leadership's lonely and it's hard, you know, whether that's with a C-suite hat on or whether that's a board director role. You know, we often get together as boards, depends which board you sit on and how frequently, but it might be once a quarter. Some get together once a month. It's pretty infrequent. I noticed, and I will let Rhonda, you go back to the beginning of the chat, but I noticed just in one of the last questions, Heather Bailey sort of asked a question around whether this is about, you know, that boards seem to get out of tune with that mission beneficiaries because they tend to be focused on risk and fiduciary and that lens. And I think that that's because when you're taught to be a board director, those are your primary roles and responsibilities. And you know, those are the things that, you know, I remember doing the ARCD course, which I really love and recommend if you haven't done it. But it gets to the point where it's almost like, here's how we stay out of jail and here's how we keep all of the legal and the technical requirements of the work at play, which is really important. And what we want to do is say, if that performance level is here, how do we take it then to the next step in the social impact space? And I think, Heather, to your question, you know, is that our predominant experience? Sometimes I think it is happily in this space, it's not because of intent. So as soon as you start to flick the question and say, well, what if we lift our gaze for the purpose for which we exist? What if we stop governing for our organisations and start governing for the social change that we're hoping for? And you see the flick in the way that people start to think and behave. And it doesn't mean losing sight of fiduciary responsibilities. You hold on to that, but you're adding those other things. And it means they start to get on the agenda. You know, that's the other thing we find is that often these things are just, you know, the agenda's full. And you go through all of the usual agenda items that you would expect to see on a board agenda. And these kinds of conversations just sometimes get missed out. And so part of the thing is, how do you make space for that?
And what we found, which is, as you can imagine, some of our higher profile board directors that have done the course sit on corporate boards as well. And what's heartening is the amount they're seeing in the work that actually applies to them as a corporate commercial board director, in understanding that the organization doesn't sit at the center of the universe. There is a customer, or there is society more broadly. And, I work as part of a bigger bank, and the question we asked at one of the starts of when we started the course was, if they had a royal commission into our organizations, could we prove that we were delivering on our purpose? Because that's why we exist. That's why we have the tax exemptions. That's why we're all here. So can we actually prove that? What do we measure really? Your P&L doesn't answer that question.
Rhonda, other questions you wanted to prioritise?
Yes, I've got lots of questions. Actually related to the time in those, quarterly, monthly meetings. There's a question here. Can you say something about the sort of information an ideal board will be reviewing at these meetings which supports the clarity of your 5 elements, and what questions will they be asking?
Interestingly, to that question, we have this little cheat sheet for people that come to our course. And I know someone said any suggested readings. There is a very cool reading pack that we have spent a ridiculous amount of time curating, because we don't want to give people too much to read, but they need enough to read that you get a good taster and you can explore different elements where you want to go. But we have this one pager that has that image that we've shared in the slide pack. And then on the back of that are here's the 10 questions you really want to hold to and think about. And in terms of those 10 questions, one of the things that we've had some directors do that do the course is just put that inside their board packs, or take a photo of it, put it on the iPad, so that when you go into meetings and you're talking about other things, it's just the refresh moment to say, well, I'm getting stuck in the details, or we're getting too technical here, or, and even just holding back and saying, one of the things we spend a lot of time on is, how do you teach yourself to stop going to solutions? Shamal mentioned that piece around, we're all everyone that sits on boards, super clever, and can come up with amazing solutions all the time, right? And you're always in fix-it mode in your day job or whatever else. So it's really easy to go into, okay, I know what the answer is. And hilariously, I could probably say this because Shamal's I'm a chair too. We both chair different not-for-profits, but chairs are bloody hopeless sometimes in terms of, okay, we're just going to solve for this and then we'll move on. And that ability to stop and say, let's just hold and just be sure, even if all you have to do is ask, hang on a second, let's be clear what problem we're solving for. Do we need to hold and probe a little bit longer to really understand the type of problem this is? And if it is a really simple technical problem, then yes, you can come up with, a very quick, let's solve for this. But if it's something that's far more complex, you're likely to do a disservice to the organisation and your beneficiaries if you jump straight into that solution mode. I think I completely lost my way on what question I was being asked then.
No, in terms of board meetings, what are the questions, right?
So
the cadence of your board meeting is really important. Understanding when you're doing what is important. Use your committees well. So one of the first questions I ask is, if we, and this is more prevalent in the US, is, so you've got your finance committee, no doubt. You've got your audit and risk committee, no doubt. But, we all exist for mission. So do you have a mission committee? Do you have a measurement, like a performance measurement committee that just looks at impact? Where is your social impact committee? That's why you exist.
The interesting thing on that committee front, one of the things that we ask boards is, how many of you, board directors, how many of you have had your boards evaluated independently? And lots of them will put their hand up. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of organisations that have never had that, and that's fine, because of resource constraints, whatever else. But most people at some point on one of the boards they've been on will have been involved in a board evaluation. And, someone's put up a comment here about culture, and we talk about culture, we talk about ethics. There's a whole lot more content in the course than what we could give you in half an hour. But when we then ask this follow-up question to that, have you been involved in a board evaluation? And then we ask, how many of you have been evaluated for mission performance? Crickets. Which is really bizarre, right? We work for social good. We're there for social good. We volunteer our time and our energy and our effort. to try and make a difference to the world, that it's really interesting that nobody's actually really playing in that space. I think we maybe had one person say that they had been asked a question in relation to that, but it seems to be a gap.
Yeah. And so in my chair role, the important to finalise that question is there are moments. So we have specific in-camera sessions, because sometimes there are many boards where like a whole suite of executives is there all the time, which is weird. But it's about saying, well, this is the space, we're going to only discuss these two matters for this hour. There is nothing else. There won't be any finance. There won't be anything else. The executive director or the CEO can come in and present for 10 minutes on that, and then they leave, and then we will talk about it. And we will figure out what questions we need answered or what we don't understand. And that's all we're going to do that day. We're not answering any questions. We're just here to think. You don't do that every time, but every other monthly meeting will have finance and risk and all the other stuff. So you need to actually create the space. Otherwise, it will never happen. And you can't do it in one day in a strategic offsite.
Somebody, I can answer this one quickly. Somebody's asked what the 3 kind of different effective leadership habits might be. So the first one was ask different questions. Number 2, seek, but also see different perspectives. And there's 2 different, the important differentiation between the seek the perspectives and the see the perspectives is we do spend quite a lot of time in the course talking about how do we put the beneficiary almost above and make sure that power imbalance isn't there. And interestingly, the research talks about upward and downward accountability. So you're holding these 2 things at once. It's not just about the governance is at the top. It's almost like flipping that so that that upward and downward accountability means that you can also flip it on its head, and actually the board is accountable to the beneficiaries that you seek to serve. So that's that piece about you seek the different perspectives, but you also really see them and listen to them and think about, well, what do we do with that? And then number 3, the third one is see systems. And I think the key thing about that see systems, and I know we didn't have time to go into the systems thinking ecosystem, the layered diagram that was in the picture. But one of the key things around that is often we're looking at one point in that ecosystem and saying, well, this is what's wrong here, or this is what we need to change. And we're not thinking about feedback loops in the system that might be otherwise there that we don't notice. There are other layers in the system where things are going on that are playing out that might be blind spots. So we might need to just stop and say, well, what else is going on here? Well, where else do I need to think about in that system? So ask different questions, seek and see different perspectives, and see systems.
And to finalise that point, the systems thinking importance came to me, I think a few years ago, we were doing some work at Harvard, and actually there's a health professor there called Professor Paul Battledon, and he used a quote that said, every system is perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes it delivers. So when you have homelessness, when you have it, you must understand the system. That system created the problem. So if you're trying to solve something without understanding what creates it, then you could be actually doing damage. And you must know that as a board.
Okay, can we get to some other questions? Earlier on, Amanda asked about scaling. Do you also ask how the organisation itself sits in the non-profit sector as part of the systems thinking? With 4,000 charities all wanting to scale, perhaps strategic partnerships, mergers are the way to go.
Wow.
Yeah.
We looked at our beautiful diagram.
Good question. Yeah, we actually have a really cool picture, but there's a whole lot that sits behind this, and we call it snakes and ladders of scaling. Anyway, but it would have taken us about 15 minutes just on that to kind of explain it. But I think the key thing about that question is it's not just about mergers and acquisitions. So that might be part of the answer. The thing about scaling that we talk about is, and Shamal mentioned it, that if you're thinking about scale as a not-for-profit or a for-purpose organisation, this also stands for social enterprises. And by the way, we have a whole lot of corporate non-execs who come to the course and go, oh my God, I wish I could send all of my board directors because it would make them think differently. Anyway, that's by the by. So on that scale front, if your job is to scale the impact, not scale your organisation, then you need to think about whether the role is, do we scale our own growth as an organisation, Or are we better off doing that with someone else? And that might be a merger and acquisition, but it could actually be a partnership. It could be a collaboration. It could also be that you share your IP and you put the work that you know works in one context and you test it in another. Or you partner up with a small organisation in a rural or regional area and you say, hey, this might be a model you're interested in, and you gift it over to them. Because if you're really there for your mission, the beneficiaries that you seek to serve, the question is, how do we best do that? And how do we scale our impact beyond how do we scale our organizations? And so there are at least 6 different options that we go through around that. And interestingly, we do another straw poll piece in class around how many of you are looking at scaling, and it's like a 99% hit rate. And then at the end of that kind of session, we ask again, how many of you do you feel are ready to scale? And everyone sits on their hands. And it doesn't mean that they won't scale in future, but it's just like there are a few other things we've got to tidy up before we do that and think about how that might occur.
And the 2 things I'd add to that is to scale, your theory of change has to be rock solid. You have to understand it inside out. You can't be just creating impact and think you are, because there's a history of millions of dollars scaling stuff from one area to another that falls apart because the system understanding. You just cannot pluck something and drop it somewhere else. So the theory of change is critical, and that's the underlying assumptions, understanding what is required for that to work, because it could be infrastructure, it could be a health system. You need a system to play in. And the second part is, there are 2, one thing we do in the course is there are 2 dimensions, I don't even know how to do that, 2 dimensions to scale. Is everyone talks about scaling the linear growth scale of doing what we're doing up and more and more and more. We serve more beneficiaries, we'll move to Queensland, we'll move to WA, right? That stuff. Scale is determined by both the scale of your activity, but the scope of your activity, because in a system, it may be that you need to do the intervention that comes after yours with the same beneficiary because its impact is created by multiple interventions. One organisation will not save a victim of domestic violence. You know, there's crisis accommodation, there's employment pathways, there's drug rehab, there's training for looking after children. There's like 10 different interventions in an order that creates impact. And unless you know where you are and what needs doing, you don't know if you're creating impact, because you might be just delivering programs with no lasting impact. Because if they fall off a cliff, for instance, after crisis accommodation, if there is no housing after that, you know, if you're over there doing employment pathways, they still have no house. You must understand the journey of the beneficiary. That is the system.
I was just looking for a question that I saw earlier, and I can't quite find it, but it was about the finance model matrix, the one that looks very complicated, that I designed. The first iteration you should have seen of that, and Shamal looked at me and said, I don't even understand this, no one's going to understand this. But the important piece around that is really just, where did the different pieces of your portfolio sit around impact and then financial viability? And somebody asked a question around how important is it for funders to really understand this? I think in the first instance, make sure your boards understand it. I don't know the role of the person that posted that question, but it's quite interesting because when we do this course, often the C-suites tend to have a good understanding of where their business model is, and they should, where you might be losing money, where you're having to make more money over here to actually counter-fund something else, where government contracts aren't meeting, you're under costing, where you can't put in the overheads. I mean, let me just acknowledge that the charity sector it's tough, the financial viability space. In terms of so I think make sure before even your funders understand it, make sure your board members understand it, because often when we talk to boards, a lot of this is new conversation. And actually, one of the interesting pieces that we do around ethics, we've had a couple of interesting examples where we've had multiple kind of boards or chairs of boards with their C-suites go in to say to government departments, we cannot do this work anymore because for this amount of money, it undercuts what we can actually provide to our beneficiaries. And interestingly, that piece around collective leadership, we had a really nice example where that stood and the government turned around and changed their mind around funding. So I think there's a couple of pieces to that. I think work out what the story is for your funders, and then depends on which funder it is. I think, there's a big conversation going on in philanthropy around pay what it takes for impact. And I think we all need to be talking as not-for-profit leaders around, we really need to have our funders pay what it takes for us to deliver the impact we need. And in a way that includes things around language. We talk about overheads, but actually pay us to be effective and do good clinical governance and pay for all the things that cost money for you to be a really great not-for-profit and serve your beneficiaries. It's a really big challenge.
There's a few other questions we didn't get to. I will pass the chat feed on so you can see them later. But one question I think is really good is, where do board directors hang out? Like, do you have groups where you, in my world, there's like a community managers group for social media to chat about challenges and learnings. Where do you guys hang out?
Maybe we need to create one, Shamal.
Oh, well, look, I've been to the AICD lounge. I imagine they hang out there. But in our terms of, so JBWE and NAB, we sort of invested originally, conceptualized the idea and put the money down to create it and run alumni through it to learn how the course works and effectiveness. I've committed to that group as mainly clients to keep them together, which I do. I know Kristy and I are keen on the AGSM groups being together as well. And so we're working on what that looks like. I think.
And what a big alumni would look like of this particular course. So, and how we combine those alum. The other group you might look at, there are some good, there is the Australian Institute of Governance. There is also our community has a community of governance people. But I think we probably need to add, where do all the directors hang out? I think it's a good question. We'll take that on notice. Thank you very much for being here. I'll pass to Rhonda to close. I'm conscious of the time. Look forward to seeing you all in class.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. There's been a few comments about when the course is on next. It's September and October for now, but more dates will be added. So I have shared the URL, but please visit csi.edu.au for more info. There's a lot of requests for more information, so I'll go through all of those and send what we can in our follow-up emails tomorrow. We have 7 webinars left for Impact 2020. I encourage you to visit our website, impact2020.online, to see those webinars and hopefully register for them. But otherwise, I'd love to thank our presenters today. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else has, and we appreciate your time and knowledge. But for now, we'll finish up. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.